What's up? Oh, shit. Okay.
What?
You can get my music out of here? Fuck, man.
What is this crazy shit
What?
on your screen? How have I just seen this today?
What, the Miku skin?
That's not Miku.
It's a version of Miku.
That's not Miku though.
It's Snow Miku.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I bought another skin.
You know,
a while back.
Whatever.
This is a previous.
Whatever.
This is a prior purchase from a while ago.
sure. It was already it was priced in.
It was priced in. Yeah, I spent $15 on Miku, and I'd prepared to spend 30, so I was like, fuck it. This forum for this, like, rope thing. Because I don't know. Just want to validate if I'm wrong about something, because I'm like, basically we had this like super cool, very, very cheap computational rope physics, more or less. It's not physics, it's just like a rope. But the thing with it is that it's got like this slightly weird behavior when we move around that I'm sure it's just like a setting that I'm doing wrong. And I just want to make sure that that is the case before I put it into Photon completely. Because it's like the whole new grab. It'd be a big amount of upside if it was in there. If not, it's not a huge loss. But I might have to spectate while you guys are playing. Well, I don't know. I think it's important.
Was it a long place or dev session today?
Yeah. It has been. It's been a long one. Yeah, I think hopefully a good one. Want to hear what KT's got about this driving controller. 'Cause he had a new one that he was talking about that it's a lot more predictable and stable and all these things, but it had this just problem because it was based on a sphere that basically like it doesn't have any raycasts like these ones, and so sometimes the wheels would just clip into the ground. Now technically speaking it's not a problem, but visually speaking it was like terrible. And then it can get stuck on inclines pretty easily if the incline was too big and stuff, and I was just like, it's not good enough. It's not good enough by itself, but it's way better in terms of not having all the extra shit that we don't need comparatively to the. So we're basically stuck between Simcade on the one hand, which is like GTA physics, where we have to handle a lot more shit, which I think we want less variables or fewer variables, and essentially purely flat arcade on the right, which doesn't really work for our use case either. And the compromise I gave to KT was use the suspension system, like the raycast, just to detect that the car's on the ground, but then just use the very, very simple way that the car propels itself in this car controller. And I'm really hoping he got there, or at least got very close. Because like my fallback is essentially just one or the other, and we adjust the map accordingly, and we just iterate in the long term. So it's like we have two really stable options that I understand where both of them go wrong. Because we've pretty much gotten out of the mystery of the last one, and so we've got a standardized car that we can apply to a bunch of different models, and I know kind of what to do with it. I could have like Edouard make 2 or 3 more chassis with that, and then conversely with this other car controller, there's really not an issue in regards to creativity and the size of the models and stuff like that per se. It's just it's got this slightly weird behavior, which means the whole map would probably just have to be more or less flat, or like really Mario Kart, where it's like you have like huge, very gradual inclines, like that are, and you can maybe jump off a cliff, like the edge of something, but it's like you're basically moving from floor to floor to floor to floor to floor, which is fine, you know. So, you know, we still got to do the parts, like the editing with all the parts.
Yeah, we only
shit.
have the assets. Also, do we need the parts to have the animations? I still think it's a little complicated.
Yeah, I mean, if they're in there and Edouard's made them, then we don't have to like trigger them or anything. We can just have them always active. It's not really an extra lift for us.
Yeah. Yeah, just have it on repeat.
Yeah, just everything's on repeat. So Edouard's done all that, so that's good at least. And actually he knows enough with Unity, like more than enough to, if you wanted to make some activation and everything like that, like he's done that before. So it's just completely isolated, just runs by itself. So it's something that fits into his workload. We don't have to do anything more for it. It's up to him, basically. But what we have to do is we just have to the building, the editing of parts, which is just work, and then the major novel shit is what the parts can do, because there's a bit of a rework with states that we have to do. So I have a day in my mind where I have to be like, all right, Casey, hang it up. Like, we gotta go with just a driving controller here.
Yeah, and then do you know what he's gonna move on to next?
Yeah, I'm gonna have him move on to parts, basically the moving, resizing parts on the car. So we give like the player like a god ray that they grab, and they can move the part around on the body. And they can scale it, and so I'll move them on to that. Unless he pushes back on it heavily and decides he'd be better suited to do the, like, what the parts do, so like the effects of the parts, in which case he can do that. I'm cool with that. It's one of us is gonna have to do it, so I'll hear what he has to say, but
Alright, I'm gonna queue then.
Go for it. Did you see that new From Software game for Nintendo Switch? This might be the reason I have to buy a Switch 2, to be honest.
All those games are going to be $80, bro.
Yeah, but it looks dope. It's scratching that itch that wants me to play, you know, Bloodborne again.
I'm gonna be talking, so
It's okay.
if you hear random yos and
Yeah,
callouts,
it's all
just
good.
mute me. But I'm gonna, you know, you should just play the next one.
You should stream it.
I know, but I'm afraid my computer's gonna blow up.
No, you could just do it in Discord. You could set it to like 720 and 30 FPS. It'll be
Good idea.
fine. Yeah.
Here, 1 minute. One V link. Good round. Twitch dot. Hey, Rourke, you want to do me a favor?
Hmm?
You want to open up Twitch?
Yeah.
Twitch.tv/XZ Scrappy XZ.
XZ Scrappy XZ.
XZ.
Is he playing for the other team?
Yeah, I just posted that shit.
Yeah, stream. We can stream snipe a little bit. Yep,
Okay, tell me where he's gonna go.
I will.
Hey, we're gonna stream snipe. He is live, according to my friend.
Alright, I'm watching an ad right now, but 1 second, I'm gonna get in
Okay,
there.
well, we have to watch this ad.
Alright, so new round just started. Okay, hold on. He's wait. Alright, they're in buy phase. Just he bought Ghost.
There's a delay.
Is there?
Yeah.
The fucker knows what he's doing. He's got way too serious of a setup. He's got his monitor tilted down and everything.
This guy's a sweat, by the way. The guy that's streaming.
He's got shit on 230 FPS. Holy fuck.
One in secret.
He's in mid. 3 in
He was mid.
Oh, fuck. Wonder how big the delay is.
NT. Alright, you can stop watching this fuck.
So the round's over?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's how do you get those green outlines and shit? Nah, or the health bars instead? Is that like a Twitch thing? You know, like when you're watching the esports and like the you see this shit?
Yes.
Is that like a Twitch thing? Like seeing the characters' health bars and stuff, like your teammates? I don't know.
I have no idea. 55 buys, 55 omen. 1 art. NT. $108 Sage and Art. Bro, I think I kill, man. I'm fucking lacking. NT.
For very, very valet, we wanted precise controls with a physics-based controller to allow for tactile, toy-like reactions between players, cars, and all of the other objects in a level. Let's break down how it works. A character in our game is actually a floating capsule. When you tilt the joystick, the capsule accelerates in the desired direction, always floating a certain height above the ground and turning to smoothly point in the direction of movement. It may seem strange that the capsule is floating, but here's 4 reasons why. Reason number 1, ground clearance. Sliding along the ground makes it easy to get disrupted by small, uneven surfaces. Hovering above the ground avoids all of this. Reason number 2, no friction. It's in the air, so there's no contact with the ground. This makes player input feel more direct, since forces on the character can be directly applied and seen without the decay of friction. Because the floating capsule can still run into walls, we also reduce friction between the character and the world to basically 0. Reason number 3, sticking to slopes. Since we're already casting a ray down to calculate the floating forces, we have the ability to adjust how far down into the ground the ray goes. This provides an extra buffer to pull down on the character when just above the surface, allowing characters to stick to the ground when transitioning down a ramp or even up one without becoming airborne. Reason number 4, control over downward forces. You can see here that the spring force that levitates the character above the ground can also be applied to the objects under the character, giving a nice bouncy response like this when the character lands on a car, for example. We've got 4 good reasons to float the capsule. So how does it work? It starts with a very simple downward raycast to get the distance to the ground. If we find the ground, we apply a dampened spring force to try to reach our desired ride height. Here's a quick look at the code, which just produces a force that is the sum of the standard spring, which is magnitude based on distance, and a damping factor based on velocity. The force is applied to the character and possibly to the object under the character in the opposite direction. Now we have a floating capsule, but it needs to stay upright. One solution is to limit the rotation of the rigid body in the engine using your physics engine's features. The downside is that any tilting from collision response, like getting hit in the head or getting hit by a car, is ignored, which impacts the charm we're going for. Instead, we calculate our own additional dampened spring force, this time acting as a torque on the character to try and return it to a desired orientation.
Coming to you.
This serves to keep the capsule upright and turn it to face a specific direction. When there's input from the joystick, we set the target orientation to point in the direction of movement, slowly turning the character in that direction as they run. At this point, we have a floating capsule that wants to stay upright and point in a specific direction. Excellent! Now it's time to actually start running around. We achieve responsive controls powered by physics with a few parameters. Max speed, which is the run speed of the character. Acceleration, which is how fast the character can reach max speed. And max acceleration force, which limits the maximum force that can be applied when accelerating. The method works like this. First, we get the input from the joystick and calculate the desired movement direction of the character in the XZ plane adjusted based on the camera angle. We multiply this with max speed to work out the ideal direction and speed right now. Then we have a variable which is our goal velocity. This goal velocity tries to match the calculated right now velocity from this frame by moving it towards this value based on the acceleration parameter. This step makes sure the player never accelerates faster than our acceleration value. Then we calculate the force necessary to change the current velocity of the character to reach this new goal velocity in a single physics update. Essentially, what acceleration would be necessary to go from our current velocity to the goal velocity in a single physics step. Because this could be a large value, we clamp it with max acceleration force and finally apply that force to the character. Tuning these values have clear outcomes. The main values are max speed and acceleration, with max acceleration force capping any abnormally large forces. This prevents the character from being too strong, while still being able to push other physics objects out of the way in a relationship that's based on their mass. Here you can see that the characters have a nice strength to push cars around, but the speed reduction on the player from the impact makes the car downforce after the jump button has been released, or the character has reached the peak of their jump. We have coyote time to add some forgiveness and allow jumping for a few moments after leaving an edge. And the opposite of coyote time, jump buffering. which will notice if you press the jump button before you land and take that action as soon as you land. Both coyote time and jump buffering essentially make the game more responsive and friendly. If you press the jump button and you're close enough, the character's going to jump.
Oh my god, I just got confused.
Of course, in this video we're not covering other elements, like the character animation system that really makes the movement shine. If you're interested, on our web... And we can think about these things and how these cars work in detail. So the first thing to mention out of the gate is that we went with a raycast-based approach. So that means that rather than actually simulating an individual rigid body for the main car and then an individual rigid body for each tire and connecting them with some kind of physics joints or something, there's actually only one rigid body going on here. So this is what this car looks like according to the physics system. It's somehow one rigid body that seems to be driving around as though it has tires and works like a car. And so that's actually what's going on here, is that we are creating forces that we're applying to this one rigid body that make it behave like a car that has tires attached to it. Here's a look at those forces. You can see that there's 4 of them, so basically at the location of each tire, we're using raycasts to find the ground underneath us, and then working out things like suspension and friction forces, and applying them to the main rigid body of the car at the location of each tire. And then the net result of these 4 forces is a single rigid body that drives around like a car.
D-Link, maybe?
So you should be on the right track now, you know, cast some rays, calculate a force for each tire, and you've got a raycast car. Thanks, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, obviously I'm going to have to go into more detail because look at these forces. They look totally confusing and complex. Like, how are these being calculated? What kind of crazy math is going on to make these wild forces that are constantly changing direction and changing their magnitude? And like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to get started. Well, the good news is that while this looks really complicated, we can break this problem down and make it significantly simpler. And the first thing to realize is that the tires are basically like children of the car. And so what we did is we created 4 transforms that we attached to the car that represent sort of like the location of each wheel. If we look at one up close, we can see that actually we can think of a tire as actually having 3 individual forces that contribute to its effect on the car. And if I turn on a little visualization of these, we can see them independently. So here in the green direction, we have suspension. So if Prim bounces up and down on the car, we can see that the force in the green direction, that is the suspension, is sort of growing and shrinking depending on how much it needs to push to keep the car floating above the ground. And then in the blue direction, you have gas and brake. So you can see a force in the blue direction is the direction that the tire likes to roll in. And so here, if we push a force in the blue direction, we can speed up the car or we can slow down the car and apply brakes. And then finally you have that red direction, which represents steering or sort of slipping. So if the tire was moving in the red direction, that would be bad, right? Tires don't like to slip. So what we end up doing is calculating a force in the red direction that reduces slipping and says, I don't like to be moving in this direction. Stop any movement in this direction. I like to move in the blue direction, but not in the red direction. And we can think about these things separately. So actually, each tire on this car is actually just 3 numbers that we need to calculate. We need to calculate a number for the green force that says, what's the suspension doing? We need to calculate a number for the blue force that says, what are we doing for rolling and accelerating and braking? And we need to calculate a number for the red direction that says, how do we make sure we're not slipping and we're actually steering and rolling in the direction we want? And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of this video doing, is actually breaking down this problem into just 3 separate numbers that we calculate independently. And once you calculate that, you get the sum of all those forces, and that is the result for each tire. Okay, let's start with the green force we were talking about before, which is the suspension force, which is basically there's a spring attached to the tires that is holding the car up off the ground. Of course, we're talking about a spring here, so we're going to need to calculate a spring force. Now, the first thing to realize about a spring is that a spring has a rest distance. It has a length that it likes to be. And then if you press the spring, it will push back to go back to the rest distance. Or if you stretch the spring, it will pull back to go back to that rest distance. And so the first number that's involved in this calculation is going to be the offset, which is basically just how far away are we from that rest distance. Now notice that this offset needs to be a signed value. So on one side, it needs to be negative, and on the other side, it needs to be
Let's get
positive.
pick for cipher.
And this number is telling you which way to go and how far to go to get back to the rest distance. And actually, if you want to calculate a spring force, that's really all you need. You need to know the offset, and then you multiply that by some value that says how strong is this spring. So here's a quick example where we set the strength to 10, and if we push the spring and then let go, you can see this green line. Let me scale it down so it's easier to see on the screen. The green line is the force we're calculating, and the force is literally just the current offset times some number, which represents the strength of the spring. So when we're pushed all the way here to an offset of negative 0.4, then our force is negative 4, and if I stretch the spring the other way, we get a force just as strong in the opposite direction.
Thought I heard one more. But...
And then you can start playing with values like this value for strength. What if we beef up the spring and give it a much thicker metal coil? Now you can see the force is a much higher value, and that results in a much faster oscillation.
Spawn side, our spawn.
So the first step to calculating a spring force is just to calculate the offset and multiply it by the strength of the spring. That gives you a force that you can apply
one tap.
directly.
Good round.
But you might be noticing that this spring seems to just bounce back and forth forever. And that's true. If you just have this much information, you get a spring that will bounce forever. Now, real shocks on cars and other kinds of springs have what's called a damper. It looks something like this. There's sort of like a plunger of some kind, and there's some fluid, and then this thing doesn't want to move. So when you try to push the spring now, it has to push the plunger through that fluid, which is resisting motion.
First round,
so that's literally what damping is referring to, is trying to slow down the motion of the spring.
Just because
so we can represent this in code if we know one other thing, if we know the current velocity of the spring. So imagine the spring's bouncing back and forth. We can stop it at any point, and we can understand the velocity of the object the spring is attached to, in this case, the tire. And if we know that, we can calculate a damping force. So a damping force is basically trying to stop any motion. It wants to resist motion. So that's why you take velocity into account. And so if I give this thing a little nudge here, you can see that it quickly kills any motion. And this is happening with a force that's in the opposite direction of the velocity. So the velocity is headed to the left, and the force is pushing to the right. And the size of the force is sort of relative to how much velocity we have. You can see down there the force is just negative velocity times damping. And again, damping is just some number that we choose. In this case, you can think of damping as kind of representing how thick is the fluid that's inside that damper there. Thicker the fluid, the more it's going to resist motion. So then when we want to calculate a better spring, we combine these two elements. So now our force is equal to the offset times the strength, which is the part that's trying to push the spring back to its rest distance. And then we tack on this damping component that says, but by the way, this spring is resisting motion. And so now when I compress the spring and I let it go, you see we don't oscillate very much. In fact, we come to rest very quickly.
Anyone wants it?
So it starts to get a little complicated to look at all these arrows and kind of like really understand what's happening. But if I slow down a little bit, you can see that at the beginning here, when the spring was squished and we let go, that we have our offset is pretty big, and that times the strength is giving us a lot of force, saying go to the left. And right now our velocity is pretty small, so it's not doing much. But as we speed up here and we head towards the home position, look at that. Our green force actually flipped directions. And just damping components negative. So imagine the spring's back.
I hear one link. What happened? Good round. Any guns? Yeah, late smoke, like last time, right? Okay, so, alright. Trains. D-Link. Smoking 10. Smoking 5. 1 in connector. 2 in connector. Good round. I'll take spike. Jet, I'm just gonna deploy smokes once you're like there, right before you peek.
Bouncing back and forth, we can stop it at any point, and we can understand the velocity of the object the spring is attached to, in this case the tire.
Great.
And if we know that, we can calculate a damping force. So a damping force is basically trying to stop any motion. It wants to resist motion. So that's why you take
One leg.
velocity into account. And so if I give this thing a little nudge here, you can see that it quickly kills any motion. And this is happening with a force that's in the opposite direction of the velocity. So the velocity is headed to the left, and the force is pushing to the right. And the size of the force is sort of relative to how much velocity we have. You can see down there the force is just negative velocity times damping. And again, damping is just some number that we choose.
1 hull.
In this case, you can think of damping as kind of representing how thick is the fluid that's inside that damper there. Thicker the fluid, the more it's going to resist
hold them in
motion.
hull.
So then when we want to calculate a better spring, we combine these two elements. So now our force is equal to the offset times the strength, which is the part
Good
that's
round.
trying to push the spring back to
3
its
more.
rest distance. And then we tack on this damping component that says, but by the way, this spring is resisting motion. And so now when I
okay.
compress the spring and I let it go, you
Not
see we
even-
don't oscillate
it's
very
might be a
much.
blessing
In fact, we
that we
come
don't
to
have it.
rest very quickly.
Can I buy someone? Raise, can
So
I
it
buy
starts
you?
to get a little complicated to look at all these
Full
arrows and kind of like really understand what's happening. But if I slow down a little bit, you can see that at the beginning here, when the spring was squished and we let go, that we have our offset is pretty big, and that times the strength is giving us a lot of force, saying go to the left. And right now our velocity is pretty small, so it's not doing much. But as we speed up here and we head towards the home position, look at that, our green force actually flipped
Same
direction.
smokes. 3.
And despite the
2,
fact that the
1.
spring still needs to go to the left to reach its rest position, our ultimate force right now is pushing in the other way. It's trying to slow this thing down. Slow down, slow down, slow down. So that's the damping force counteracting the regular spring component to keep this thing from oscillating over and over again. And what's great
One
about
flank.
this is once you've got this
Moment
formula,
flanking.
it's just 4 numbers: offset times strength minus velocity times damping. 2 of these numbers are numbers you just decide, the strength and the damping. And you get very different behaviors depending on what you set these numbers to. Here's an example of a spring with a strength of 100 and a damping of 1. So this thing is going to bounce back and forth a lot because the damping is very small. It has a small effect on the system. This would be like a spring with a really thick coil of metal and maybe just air inside the plunger.
Petty.
Now what if we change this and we say the damping is 30?
I
We took the
should've
air
known
out
this
of the
guy.
plunger, we just poured a bunch of honey in there. And so now this spring really is not going to want to move. So even if I compress it down and let it go with the same strength coil, it has to try really hard to push that spring because it's really resisting any kind of motion. And maybe somewhere in the middle, let's take out that honey and put oil inside, and now you get something that doesn't resist it too much, lets it get right back to the rest position, but it doesn't overshoot very much. And so these are two numbers that you can then tune to get a spring to behave exactly how you'd like. Now one thing to keep in mind is that these numbers are relative to the mass involved. So imagine you had a really weak spring and you put it on a car, the car would just slam down to the ground because it's so heavy. Similarly here, depending on the mass of the objects that you're trying to affect with this spring, you might have to make the strength and the dampening bigger or smaller depending on the mass involved. So here we have again our final formula for the spring force, and this is what is called a dampened spring force because it has the damper involved. But basically it's just 4 numbers. You got to work out the offset, how far away are we from our rest distance, multiply that with the strength of the spring, and then subtract the velocity of the thing the spring is attached to, in the direction of the spring by the way, times the damping, and then you get spring force. So this is all we need to calculate that green force on our car. And here's a look at the actual code for the suspension force, and as you can see, this formula is basically implemented directly in the code. We do some setup to work out things like our offset and our velocity, but then we plug those in and we have our formula right there, offset times strength minus velocity times damping, and then that force is applied at the position of this particular tire. Okay, so here's a look at a car with just those green suspension forces implemented. And you can see we're able to keep the car up off the ground now. But if we bump into the car and send it moving, we've got shocks, but we have absolutely no traction whatsoever. So good job, we made a hovercraft. Okay, so as the car's driving along here, what we can do is we can zoom in on each individual tire and get the velocity of that individual tire, which is just the velocity of that point on the car's rigid body. And then we can break this up into our blue and our red directions. So the blue direction, of course, is the direction the tire likes to roll, and the red direction is the direction the tire doesn't like to slide. So we can take the current velocity for each tire, which in this case is this orange arrow, and we can use a dot product to break it up into 2 separate components. The component that's going in the rolling direction, the blue direction, and the component that is in the sliding direction. And now we're going to currently focus our attention on the red direction because that's the force we're calculating right now. It's going to produce steering. So if we just think about this is the current velocity of the tire in the direction of the red line, the direction we don't want to be sliding. And so we're going to need to calculate some sort of force that says don't slide in this red direction, right? Ultimately, we don't really want any velocity in the red direction because that velocity means the tire is slipping sideways. So we're going to need to calculate some kind of force for this. Force, of course, is mass times acceleration. So if we want a force, we can think about it in terms of an acceleration. And an acceleration is just a change in velocity. So what we can do is ask ourselves, what change in velocity would we like to occur? Well, actually, that's pretty straightforward because we currently have this gray line. That is the current velocity in the direction of the red sliding direction. And we don't want any of that velocity to exist. We don't want to slide sideways. So really what we want is a change in velocity that is the opposite. We want to remove all of this velocity. So if we just take that current velocity and flip its direction, that's the change we would like to have occur.
Can you actually cam B real quick?
At this moment, when we flip it, of course, is mass times acceleration. So if we want a force, we can think about it in terms of an acceleration.
We hear neon?
And an acceleration is just a change in velocity. So what we can do is ask ourselves, what change in velocity would we like to occur? Well, actually, that's pretty straightforward because we currently have this gray line. That is the current velocity in the direction of the red sliding direction. And we don't want any of that velocity to exist. We don't want to slide sideways. So really what we want is a change in velocity that is the opposite. We want to remove all of this velocity. So if we just take that current velocity and flip its direction, that's
one
the change
secret.
we would like to have occur. And
Nectar
at
last
this
scene.
moment, when we flip it, we could also, for example, scale it down a little bit.
I
and
can play
say,
main with you,
well,
Cypher.
we're okay with the tire sliding a little bit, so maybe we're only going to try and remove 50% of the velocity. Or the car should be sliding a lot right now, we're on ice, so let's only remove maybe 10% of the velocity. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the current velocity of the tire in the sliding direction, and we're going to flip it around. And that then is a change in velocity
He's
that we
probably
want
saving
to have
his
happen. So we
knowledge.
take that vector, we divide it by some amount of time, a small amount of time, to say this is the acceleration we want. We want a change in velocity over time.
Razors.
And then that value becomes our force. So here you can see, if we just take the velocity in the
Where was
red
saved?
direction,
What the?
and we completely negate it and use that as our force. Here's a car example with 100% grip. And you can see the tires do not like to slide. And of course,
Can we do A again?
they're so grippy that maybe the car will flip over depending on things like the center of mass. Now here's an example where we're only canceling out 5% of the slip velocity. And now you can see we've got real slidey car. This is a front wheel drive car, by the way, so it's not going to spin out too much, but it is really slidey.
pick
And now
for you,
we've made a
Cypher.
drifting game
I'll do quick smoke.
just by saying we have basically 5% traction in the red direction. And then here's another example where now the front tires have
Screens.
30% grip, the rear tires have 5% grip, and it's a rear-wheel drive car. And now you can see this car really likes to spin out. I'm not even steering right now.
2,
We're still
1.
doing donuts.
1 is Hall.
And so, you know, this gives you a lot of control over the car that you can think of in simple terms of just how much grip do we want to retain
Where the
as a
fuck?
percentage for each tire. Now, in our game, we don't just use a fixed value like this. We actually use a lookup curve. And so this is slightly complicated, but
Fuck.
basically what you can see
One
here is
behind
that
screens.
the x-axis you can think of as a lot of control over the car that you can think of in simple terms of just
NT.
how much grip do we want to retain as a percentage for each
Cypher,
tire.
can you pick either and then just
Now,
cam
in
it?
our game, we
Just
don't
for the
just
info.
use a fixed value like this. We actually use a lookup curve.
We'll slow play.
And so this is slightly complicated, but basically what you can see here is that the x-axis you can think of as how much of the tire's velocity is in the red direction right now. So 0 would mean the tire's not sliding at all, it's just rolling forward perfectly like it is right now. And 1.0 would mean the tire is completely sliding sideways. So we take that and we use that number, how much is the tire sliding as a percentage of its velocity, to look up into these curves here to decide how much traction should the tire have right now. So 1.0 would mean full traction, let's get rid of all the velocity in the sliding direction. And 0.0 would mean we don't care at all, let it slide. And you can see by the shape of the curve here that basically what we have is if the tires aren't slipping too much, they have a lot of traction. But once they start sliding too much, they lose tons of traction and become really slippery. And this is based loosely on how real tires work.
One in connector.
Tires have a lot of grip at first because the rubber is kind of stretching and
Thanks,
maintaining
folks.
contact with the ground. And then at some point, they start to slide. And when they start to slide, of course, the friction drops. And so these are just two curves here. I've got curves for the front tires and the back tires tuned separately to give the car the feel I'm looking for. But ultimately in our game, this is how we implemented the feel we wanted. We used a simple curve that we could just draw and test to get the behavior we were looking for. Here's a look at how that is in code. And you can see again we have a little setup here where we work out things like the velocity in the steering direction. And then we decide how much grip we want to maintain. And we use that to calculate an acceleration that becomes a force that we apply at the location of the tire in the direction of the red
That's
line, which
5.
is the steering direction. Okay, at this point we now have a car with suspension and also steering forces or friction forces, so the tires
Can't
don't
see.
like to slide sideways. And so if Prim gives a little push and hops inside, you can see that we've created a soapbox derby racer. We have a car with suspension and steering, but no engine and no brakes. Alright, so now we're down to the last force we need to calculate, which is in this blue direction, and it's comparatively simple, because all we really need to do is apply some force in the
I'll
blue
half by.
direction, and
That
whichever
way-
direction the force is, the tires are going to slowly roll in that direction. So all I really need to work out is what kind of forces to apply to do things like accelerate and brake the car. A simple approach for acceleration would be when the player is pressing the accelerator, we just apply a constant force in the blue direction. Let's say 100. Go. 100, 100, 100, 100. Right. Constant force equals constant acceleration. And so the car is just going to kind of speed up forever. So we need something slightly more sophisticated, and in our game we went with this simple animation curve that kind of represents the power or the torque of the car's virtual engine. And basically what you can see here is the amount of torque, or sort of forward force in this blue direction, is based on this lookup curve. And the curve is basically saying how fast is the car going right now. If the car's at a standstill, then we get 50%
Brandon,
of our
can you buy someone just because it's the
power
last round for us?
of our engine. And when the car is kind of going at like mid-speed here, we have access to full torque. And then as we approach our top speed, the torque drops down. And so
not
the
Rain, I mean
horizontal
Jet, can you buy
axis here is just how
because you have
fast is the
knives.
car going compared to its top speed. And top speed is just a number that we select, right? So let's say the top speed of this car is 10 units per second. Then right now it's going at 10 units per second, so we have no access to the torque. But now we're going 0 units per second, so we have access to 50% of our torque. And so that 50% or 100% of our torque, again, is just a multiplier on some number, which is how strong is the engine, which is just the force value we've decided. And this is roughly based on real engines that have less torque down at the low RPMs, and then they have like a band of their maximum torque, and then the torque drops off as they sort of redline or start spinning really fast as you get up to top speed. And this was enough for us to get a somewhat realistic car that behaved in a way we could easily tune and control with just one curve. Okay, now that gets the car going, but what about stopping the car?
Coming to you.
Well, it turns out we've already solved this problem, because stopping the car is the exact same thing as steering the car. Remember that the force in the red direction for steering was basically saying, hey, I don't want any velocity in this red direction. Tires don't like to slip, so let's calculate a force to remove velocity in that direction. Well, when the brakes are applied, we're doing the exact same thing. We want to basically remove any velocity in this rolling direction. And so we do the exact same math we do
I can smoke Heaven and Link
in the blue direction this time to produce a brake.
I'll smoke it.
And you can do other things with this, like you can put a maximum value on it and clamp it so that your brakes have some kind of maximum force they can apply to slowly bring the car to a stop. And you can also add things like rolling friction, which work very similarly, which is when you're not pressing the gas, we apply a light braking force in the opposite direction to slow the tires down to a stop. Here's a quick look at the acceleration code, and you can see basically we're just working out the car's speed, dividing it by the top speed of the car, using that to look up into our power curve, and then applying that force directly in the blue direction.
It sounded pretty calm, so
for each tire. And there we have it. We have a fully driving car.
It's always hard to do though.
And steering and acceleration and braking. And we can really tune this pretty easily by adjusting just a small number of values.
Does that work?
Like the suspension,
10 minutes?
And the
Can
grip, and the power.
How about?
Thank you for watching this video, and if you'd like to support us, you can definitely check out our game.
I think these guys muted Dump.
Dude, that's what I'm saying. I think Dump is just muted. I think you unmuted Dump. I think it's server muted.
No, it's not. It says notification settings all.
No, I might have muted Dump then. Because I never get any pings or anything from Dump. That's why it's Dump. Because you can just put shit in there and it's not going to ping anybody.
So, hello everyone, my name is Matthew Harris from Criterion Games, and welcome to Vehicle Feel Masterclass, balancing arcade accessibility with simulation depth. Style led on to the incredibly popular Burnout franchise, and then on to Need for Speed Hot Pursuit and Most Wanted. Over a decade, accessibility options such as help with braking or steering. But you're trying to build a realistic motor. Each context has its own requirements from the vehicle. If we change the context, we should reevaluate the vehicle and see if it still suits it. One example of this would be the Sparrow in Destiny, which I really enjoyed driving as a transport vehicle, but when they introduced Sparrow Racing, I didn't feel like the vehicle lent itself to racing very well. As a timed special event, this was fine, but if they wanted to build more of the game around racing, I'd hope that they would retune the vehicle to fit that context. During production, it's also easy to forget about updating a vehicle if the context shifts during development, particularly if that vehicle has shipped before. We built the speeder bike for Star Wars Battlefront 1, and because it shipped in that game, we made the assumption that it wouldn't take too much more work for Star Wars Battlefront 2. However, the new game's map topography, coupled with some tech debt, ended up meaning we had to rework it entirely for the sequel. Vehicle and environment are complementary to each other, and changing one may require changing the other. So for this next part of the talk, I'm going to use motorsport racing as a context, served well by this physical model. Look into each piece and we'll show how it deforms as the wheel moves forward. Attention to the way the chassis of the vehicle rocks back and forth during gear changes due to the simulation of the drivetrain. Watch how the body rolls to the side during corners due to the simulation of tire friction and suspension. The depth of the simulation shows through and gives the player precise control and physical play to master. And tune them as well as they possibly. Doing too much on screen doesn't feel very physical. Switching to a weak convergence, we see a lot more motion in the frame. The vehicle feels dynamic and alive. However, because the convergence is so weak, the vehicle appears to be pointing off screen during large turns. This can make it tricky to control as you can't see where you're going. In this situation, we could either tighten up the camera or add velocity extrapolation to our look-ahead target so that the camera looks towards the vehicle's direction more effectively. The camera also needs to sell the physicality of the vehicle and feedback what the simulation is doing. A good example of this is the land, which consisted of seeing as we evasive maneuvers. In your controls like you might find planes in production. In a similar style to provided the handle quite nicely, we looked at
it was really important that this approach was not going to be viable, is that if you're setting the velocity on these vehicles at every frame, the interaction with external forces, when you're crashing into walls, vehicles are crashing into you, or something else is smashing into you, what seemed simple at first actually kind of spiraled out of control on the engineering side, trying to take in all these external influences, and it started feeling like we were building our own kind of crappy physics engine on top of this. So we thought, let's not do this. Let's return to the physically accurate simulation, and let's leverage this amazing sort of physics middleware that we have, and let's use that. However, there were definitely some lessons that let's make it arise from the interaction of simple systems. If we learned anything from our character vehicles, it is that we had to start thinking about our physics parameters, not just as the equations, but as to how our designers thought about these concepts, and make sure that we mirror back to them. So I'm going to go through a bunch of examples that hopefully two different vehicles here. The top one is kind of a fast, zippy vehicle, and the bottom one is a lumbering vehicle. What might not be obvious here is that these vehicles have the same top speed, and they have the same amount of time to reach that top speed. The only thing that's different here is the shape of that curve, I think. Take a look at an early prototype that I made with Patrick and one of our rendering engineers, Patrick. It has to be controlled, finds the rest.
Our content creator
suspension under the hood. And that both gives you a consistency in handling, but now you can really draw out the vehicle and figure out what this vehicle is about. Another thing we did here was that we had the animators actually animate the full extent of the suspension. So how high up can the wheels go and how low does it go to the ground. This meant that ideally the suspension will never look bad, it'll never clip into the vehicle, but also it allowed us to actually not just have the wheel maybe move simply up and down. They could do a sort of a rotational suspension, they can do whatever looks good. While under the hood, the suspension is basically just interpolating between these values. And I think this really let our engineers and designers on one hand focus on what felt fun and what was good with the vehicle, and then allowing a lot of the other artists and animators to do their job and bring out the personality in the vehicle without the two teams stepping on each other's toes too much. So hopefully these examples kind of help clarify some of the pillars and how we went through them. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Patrick.
That is, we essentially made our vehicles a lot more like a Flintstone vehicle. We connected these cylinders in the middle so that if you had at least half of the vehicle on the surface, the other wheel would pick it up and you'd be stable. This fixed our edge cases that we were seeing before. Though this doesn't look physically accurate, it's much better that it's stable. And it still looked good in situations where we had small bumps on either side. The wheels were properly reacting. So this was a compromise that we felt the most important thing is stability and control. And we can live with that. And it also meant that if you ground and you could actually get stuck. So this was a problem that we needed to solve. And the way we did that is we essentially made our vehicles a lot more like a Flintstone vehicle. We connected these cylinders in short-term bandage approach. So if we before were just doing 4 steps for 4 frames of oil integration, instead what we would do is a bunch of little steps in a fixed time step, which we picked to be about 200 hertz or 5 milliseconds for our player vehicles. And we'd do oiler integrations across that. So we were very happy with that. I want to put up a little bit of pseudocode quickly to show how we did our stepping. Amount that we are going to move within the frame and extend our raycast by that much. We can then step it in each sub-step until we eventually get our suspension to start to intersect with the ground. And we will start to apply forces. It'll slow us down and maybe compress a little bit more, but the forces get stronger, and then we can actually counterbalance it. So now, instead of slamming into the ground, we have successfully landed, and our suspension has successfully kept us away from it, honing in on key parts of the collision and increasing the priority to get more complex behavior. We needed this in order to do things like would make sure that we could solve the problems that we were having in our early prototypes of losing control when you hit walls. Fix the bug and know that we weren't going to break something that you rotate around and multiply by the speed that you rotate around it. In order to do this kind of correction over time and incorporate flips and twists and stuff, you actually have to rotate the axis around which you're rotating over time, which is a process called precession and is really, really, really hard to solve. It's like a higher order equation, and I tried, and I failed, and I had to move on. So we had to find a way of simplifying this / cheating horribly in order to make this work. Here's how we cheated. The moment our vehicle gets air, what we're going to do is take its orientation right there and then do the cast like I mentioned before and figure out where the orientation we want to be at when we land. We can pick an axis around which we can rotate from this orientation. Is that showing up? That's not really showing up. There's a little arrow there. We take the difference between this orientation and our landing orientation, get an axis we can spin around that will make us get to that orientation. And then we take our angular speed here, multiply it by the amount of time it's going to take us to land, and then round that to the nearest full revolution. If you spin a full revolution around an axis, you wind up right where you are again. So then all we have to do is apply the difference between this orientation and our landing orientation as an angle, add that to the full amount of revolutions, and we get a result that looks something like this, where we're spinning around a single axis over time, getting a lot of cool motion, but you don't really know that it's just that single axis. And the part that's important to note is we could totally change the axis around which we spin by doing this process. Like our angular velocity could change drastically at that one point. But the process of getting air is chaotic enough that your eye doesn't necessarily catch that. And we hide the fact that we're doing this by that process. Now, if we weren't on a ballistic trajectory or we allowed any kind of input to change when we were going to land, and we change angular velocity in the middle of the air, it's very obvious and it looks really bad. But at that one moment of getting air, our brains can't really see it, the change, and we hide that. And then this much simpler approach works perfectly fine, and we shipped with it, and I absolutely love it. And so with that, that wraps up our technical deep dive.
I was very happy when I got to the point where I could have one engineer focus on sea, and one focus on air, and one I focused on land.
Okay. Alrighty, let's